Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, May 18th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Broadband Business Models, and this is the second of a three-part series on the topic. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. For your content questions related to the presentation, type those in the questions box, again located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast is sponsored by the APA Technology Division. You can learn more about all of our divisions at planning.org/divisions. And up on your screen is a list of our webcasts coming up. You can register for none of these at the moment, but you will be able to on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. We're just trying to get the rest of the information together so we can submit these for credits. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to register for most, if not all, of the ones listed. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account. Up at the top, under the CM log, you can search for CM activities and enter in either the title of today's webcast or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded distance education sessions that are available. Just head over to our webcast webpage for more information and to listen to those. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And hey, we're recording today's webcast. It'll be available on our YouTube channel. Just head over there and search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up, and we'll have a PDF of the presentation available at the conclusion of today's session on our webcast webpage. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to today's speaker to give us an introduction and get us rolling. Kate, I just turned the controls over to you.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I'm going to show my screen. Is that, can you see the screen?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'd like to thank the Ohio State Chapter for hosting the webinar today, and thank everybody for joining in. As Christine mentioned, this webinar is sponsored by the Technology Division. I am the past chair of the Technology Division. And over the past year, when we had discussions about webinars that we wanted to sponsor, a couple of our members have mentioned that they have done surveys of their divisions that they've participated in, and the issue related to broadband kept coming up. And one of the things that planners were asking for was more information and education on the topic, because this is something that they haven't necessarily been familiar with. So a little bit of background about myself. I am city planner. I have a degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Illinois and a master's degree in information technology from George Washington University. And I have been working with communities. I'm a private practice consultant. I have my own business, and I've been working with communities primarily in the Rocky Mountain West, but also in the Midwest, on doing telecommunication and broadband assessments and plans since 1997. So I've been working on these issues for quite a while. Also in that capacity, I've worked with ATA on a number of projects I co-authored the PAS report on broadband and planning, have been chair of the technology division, and current co-chair of the Smart City Task Force, and am participating on the infrastructure task force, primarily because of the broadband expertise that I have. So that's a little bit on my background. As I mentioned, I have been doing this for 20 years. I'm trying to advance the slide here.
Kate, sometimes that first slide will stick. Just right-click your mouse and hit next.
Okay. Okay, I see. Yeah.
We got it. Okay, great.
So, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years, and as I've worked on broadband planning projects in communities, I'm primarily working with economic development officials, and I've always thought that it was important for planners to be at the table. I'm glad to see that this topic is gaining some traction in the organization, and just sort of wanted to talk a little bit about the top 10 reasons why I think it's important that planners be involved in broadband planning. And the first, if you look at the first three things on this list, these are things that city planners do with pretty much every project that we work on. We do comprehensive plans, so we look at the big picture for the community, not just on a particular facility. We work with community organizations in our counties, in our localities. We work with all the departments within the municipalities on development reviews, on various plans. And these are the kinds of skills that are necessary for a community to undertake with broadband plans too. And planners have those skills and bring them to the table. Also, as if you tuned into the webinar at the last month when we did the first in this series, Eric Frederick talked about the importance of broadband to our communities for economic development, for smart city technologies. So as this infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, becomes more critical for our communities, it becomes more important for planners to make sure that the infrastructure, the broadband networks are there, to provide for those services that people are demanding. And also broadband technologies are a tool that can help us achieve other planning goals in smart growth and conservation, sustainability, downtown revitalization. People are demanding these services. Our constituents are demanding them. So planners need to understand broadband networks. They need to make sure their plans are providing for them so that we can meet the other goals in our communities as well. And I think number 10 is probably one of the more important reasons that planners should be at the table, because we're one of the few people that come to the broadband plans that are truly representing the entire community. It's in our AICP Code of Ethics that we make sure that everybody in the communities, their needs are considered. And often they're not at the table, and planners are representing, those minority, low-income groups, and we need to do that in broadband planning as well. So with that being said, what we're going to be talking about today, and what Christine mentioned, this is the second webinar in the series. At the last webinar, Eric talked about some basics of broadband planning, the benefits that broadband brings to our communities, why local planners should be involved, talked about broadband adoption. I'm going to be focusing more specifically on the planning process for a broadband, and even more specifically on the deployment models. And then the third in the series, which will be in June, and that will be conducted by Dale Neath, and he's going to be talking about rural broadband projects. So to get started here, before we talked about the planning process, I did want to go over some few basics and statistics and trends, because that will sort of help us understand why we need to do some things in the planning process, maybe a little bit differently than they're used for. So to talk about current trends and statistics, I'm going to rely on the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, Broadband Deployment Report of 2018. If you're not familiar with these reports, the FCC issues a progress report on broadband deployment about every other year. The most recent one was released in February. They collect statistics from the providers, and they assess how we are doing in deploying broadband and what proportion of the population has access to those services. For the purposes of their progress report, the FCC defines broadband as any technology that can deliver speeds for advanced telecommunications, such as high-quality video, voice, data, and graphics. That broadband can be delivered over a variety of technologies, including cable, fiber, DSL, fixed wireless, and mobile technologies. So broadband is the technology. How FCC measures it is by establishing benchmarks for speeds. So since 2010, the benchmark for the minimum speed required to deliver these advanced telecommunication services is 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload. Now, there are different definitions that are used for different programs, but for purposes of the report that the FCC does, and like I say, they do these reports every other year, their definition, current definition for fixed services, and that's cable, DSL, fiber, is 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload. For mobile wireless, it's 10 megabits download and 3 megabits upload. And for schools, they have a benchmark of 100 megabits per 1,000 users. That's their short-term goal. Over the long term, that goal will be increased to 1 gigabit per 1,000 users for schools. So that is when I talk about the statistics and who has access to broadband, these are the speeds that we are looking at. Now, it's also important to note that the FCC has a national broadband plan that was released in 2010, and it had a goal for 2020, which is now just 2 years away, of 100 megabits upload and, I'm sorry, that should say 100 megabits download and 50 megabits upload. So just reverse that. This is important to remember is we are planners. We take the longer view. We don't look at our other facilities like water and sewer facilities and say, oh, we have the capacity to meet our needs today, so we're fine and we don't need to do anything. We look at 10, 20 years and what kind of capacity are we going to need in that infrastructure 10, 20 years down the road. That's basically what the FCC National Broadband Plan did. The current needs are met by the 25 megabit download speed, but the National Broadband Plan, saying looking out to 2020, which we're fast approaching, our goal should be 100 megabits download speeds. And for anchor institutions, and anchor institutions includes hospitals, schools, local government buildings, they should have 1 gigabit access. So that's the long-range goal that we should be planning for. And some communities are even now installing gigabit networks and saying that 100 megabit network is not even an adequate long-range goal. So for purposes of planning, the current standard that FCC is using, again, is the 25 megabit download, but their long-range plans are for 100 megabit download and 1 gigabit for anchor institutions. And some communities have even gone beyond that. So looking at the status of where we are now as far as current broadband deployment, again, these statistics are from the FCC, and you will see at the bottom of the screen, I have a link to all of these documents. So if you go to the website and download the PowerPoint, you'll be able to access all of this information. But the current status is the urban areas are pretty well served by fixed services. 97.9% of urban areas have access to broadband technology at speeds of 25 megabits download. Now, when they say access, what that means is that they collect this information on a census block basis, and so that is the percentage of households who live in census blocks that have the broadband technology service. Doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in that census block is subscribing to service, but they at least have access to one provider that is providing that service. If you look at the rural areas, you can see that there is a disparity. Only 69.3% of rural areas have access to fixed service, 25 megabit download, and only 50% have access to both fixed services and wireless access, services. One of the things the FCC report notes in this 2018 report is that it's not wireless access by itself, or even fixed access by itself is no longer adequate. So many people have smartphones and tablets that you really need to have both in your community. So they are now looking at, do you have both mobile service and do you have fixed service? So this table demonstrates that there is a disparity between the urban and rural areas. That's been consistent throughout the entire time that they have produced these reports, and it's also in tribal areas where you have that disparity as well. The other disparity, or what is called the digital divide, comes in looking at high income and low income counties. So if you look at high income counties, and these are counties where they're in the top 25% of median income throughout the country. 84% have access to fixed service, 97% to mobile service, whereas low-income counties, and they're in the bottom 25% of median income throughout the United States, only 58% have access to fixed service that meets that minimum definition of broadband. You have the same disparity when you look at high population density counties and low population or low density counties. Again, you don't see that disparity as much with mobile services. And one of the reasons for this is because it is more cost effective to serve low density areas with wireless services. It's expensive to lay the fiber. You don't have enough population per square mile to offset the revenue of the fixed service infrastructure, whereas wireless service, you can broadcast to bigger areas. Rural areas, and not surprisingly, the rural areas are also the low, where you have the low density, and so you have the disparities there. But you also have the disparities between the high-income counties and the low-income counties. So that's important to note as we move forward. Okay. Some other trends that were noted in the report is the growth in smartphone data usage in tablets. You can see just in the 4 years between 2012 and 2016, and this report is based on data that was provided from the providers, service providers in 2016. You can see that the growth grew from 1 gigabit per month average to 4 gigabits per month. So it grew by 4 times. You can see now that 18% of the population has access to 1 gigabit service. So again, if we are planning for our communities to be competitive in the global economy, and we are looking at what other communities are doing, you can see that there's more of a movement to even beyond that 100 megabit long-range standard to 1 gigabit service. The FCC did receive quite a few comments that the upload speeds need to be increased. As I mentioned, the current definition or benchmark that they use is 25 megabit download, 3 megabit upload. There are a lot of comments saying that 3 megabit upload is not adequate. While many people are still using broadband primarily to surf the web, to stream movies, and they're downloading the data, you have more and more of the workforce that is working from home. You have people that are producing content and video and uploading them to the web. And so that 3 megabit upload is no longer adequate, according to a lot of the comments. The FCC also notes that while wireless service is becoming more widespread and people are relying on it, it's not a substitute for fixed service. You have to have both. They work in concert with each other, and so that needs to be your measurement. It's not do you have one or the other, but really do you have both services. Broadband adoption lags behind broadband availability. Eric talked about that last month in the webinar that he gave. and we need to address broadband adoption as well. I'm not going to do that so much in this webinar, but if you download the webinar that Eric gave back in April, he did talk about adoption and some strategies for increasing broadband adoption as well. And finally, that broadband cost in the U.S. Really ranks in the middle of industrialized countries. The FCC collects data on broadband costs for 30 countries, and depending on the methodology they use, the U.S. ranks either 10th or 20th. So we're either in just barely make the top third, or we're almost in the lower third of what it costs for us to access these broadband services. And this is one more chart. It does not come from the FCC report. This comes from the Pew Internet.org website. They have a lot of fact sheets on adoption and on internet usage. If you're looking for statistics, this is a good one to go to. But I wanted to put this graph here because this is the percent of adults who have broadband at home, this is fixed service. And you can see the graph trends downward in 2018. It had steadily increased from 2002 to 2016, and in the last year it trends downward. And one of the reasons is because people are relying more on their mobile homes. They're unplugging their fixed landline services, their fixed internet services, and relying mostly on their mobile phones. And so that's an important trend for planners to note. It means really sort of two things. Is that one, if we're designing planning applications, websites, surveys or whatever, we need to be making sure those are mobile friendly because more people are accessing the internet that way. And it also means that we're going to be seeing more demands for tower and infrastructure to support that wireless broadband services. So those are just some statistics that I wanted you to be aware of before we started planning for the, talking about the planning process. When we look at what the objectives are when we do broadband planning, they're somewhat similar to our normal planning processes, but I think one of the first one in there, the education piece, the education component, is probably more important or more common in these broadband planning efforts because it's something that the communities are not fully aware of. Planners and our public officials are used to dealing with zoning issues, with water and sewer and road infrastructures. These are traditional planning and facility projects that planners and public officials have dealt with over the years. We have a history of that. But broadband services are typically provided through the private sector. And so our public officials and our staff members don't necessarily have that background in dealing with broadband networks. So a lot of times the initial effort in undertaking a broadband plan is to have that education component and also to build support within the community that this is something that the local officials need to address. Even though it's private, a lot of it is private sector infrastructure, we need to develop partnerships, we need to coordinate with that, and in some cases, we maybe need to supplement their networks to actually meet our needs. And we need to build support for that so that the efforts that are begun, planning efforts that are begun, will be carried forward, because it takes a number of years, like any planning process, to actually implement the plans. So the planning process for broadband planning, if you look at the main steps, they're very similar to what you use for any other planning process. You start by engaging the stakeholders, conducting surveys, community meetings, interviews. Oftentimes there's a task force that's put together to help address these issues, doing a needs assessment, looking at what the issues are that the community is dealing with, inventorying the broadband infrastructure that is there so you have an idea what is available to you. Where it might diverge a little bit from the planning process is actually looking at the broadband application. Whether you are, the main focus of the effort is driven by economic development objectives, by telemedicine needs, by educational needs, looking at what are the public safety needs, what are the applications that we're looking at here, because that's actually going to dictate to some degree the types of network that you're going to be looking at. developing a vision with goals and objectives and priorities, evaluating alternatives, and evaluating alternatives because there is community investment here, because this is a little bit different than roads or water and sewer, where you don't have competitors in the market that are providing services. If the community is going to be making investment in broadband infrastructure, they really need to do a risk analysis to make sure that whatever revenue they're relying on is going to be marketable. And then looking at the action plan, and again, the business plan for operating any network that you might want to invest in, the engineering and the financials. So like I said, the overall process really isn't that much different than the planning process, but there are a few things that you might emphasize a little bit differently when you're planning for broadband networks. So who are your broadband strategy stakeholders, your broadband stakeholders when you undertake the planning process? They're really everyone. As we mentioned earlier, broadband is critical infrastructure now. If you're a job seeker, you're going to be applying online. If you are accessing medical services, there's more telehome medicine applications. You're going to be filing forms online. Education, school age children today often have their own tablets and are relying on doing homework at home and accessing online research. Pretty much everybody is using broadband. And so you need to engage everybody in a stakeholder, either through community meetings, either through a community survey. You need to make sure that you are talking to all of the sectors of your community to identify what their needs are. Not only what their needs are, but what resources that they can bring to the table. For instance, one community that I worked in, it turned out that the parking commission was actually installing fiber downtown because they wanted to have smart meters. This was a resource. They had the conduit that we didn't know was available, and so the community was able to share that conduit and pull fiber in for other uses as well. Oftentimes schools are going to be passing a technology bond and maybe investing in the fiber network. Is there an opportunity again to share with them some of the costs of pulling in dark fiber through that same network that can then be leased for economic development? So when you talk to the various stakeholders, you don't only ask them, what issues are you dealing with, but what are your applications and what resources can you bring to the table? Because you would be surprised at some of the investments that these other community partners are making. So once you engage the stakeholders, the next step in the process was doing a needs assessment. And when you do a needs assessment, it's really important to ask a number of different questions. You need to ask about connectivity. Okay, this is your basic statistic. Does your community have access to broadband services? If you're in an urban area, as demonstrated by the statistics, it's likely that you're going to have at least one provider in your communities that are providing services. If you're in the rural areas, that's going to, as we saw, there are going to be some pockets that are maybe not getting the broadband services that everybody else is getting. We need to look at capacity. And again, this is looking at bandwidth for future growth. It's not looking at just, are we meeting that FCC standard of 25 megabit download today, but do we have plans, or are we going to have the capacity to meet the 100 megabit or gigabit standards to accommodate future growth, especially when we're talking about economic development and growth for our educational institutions. Another big concern is the broadband that you have affordable. And one of the things is just to look at the cost that you have in your community and compare it with other areas. I've done this a number of plans where I've done a table and have just gone to the websites of the providers and said, okay, here's what they are advertising for their services in our localities, and then just went to other communities and looked at what they were charging. What is not uncommon is that in urban areas where you have a lot of competition and a lot of providers, broadband costs can actually be a lot lower than they are in rural areas. So if you look at the FCC data, you might see that your rural area is served by broadband, but when you look at the cost factors, you find out that it's not as affordable And so you're not going to be competitive when you're trying to attract industry and jobs to your community. So that choice of having multiple providers is important. It's important for a couple reasons. You want to have choice in, do we have the wireless providers and fixed broadband? You want to have both of those. You want to have multiple providers so that you can have affordable, competitive costs. Multiple providers will also provide different service packages, and so that gives the institutions and the businesses in your community a choice to find a package that meets their needs the best. And probably one of the most important reasons for having multiple providers is redundancy. In planning, we call this resiliency. If one of the networks goes down, if you have multiple providers, then you have the option of maybe going out on another network to get your services, especially when we're talking about emergency planning. Having those backup networks is very important. Even as a business, since businesses rely on the broadband networks to conduct their businesses, to communicate with their customers, to run their application. If the network goes down, that is time lost, that is money lost, and so many of them will actually subscribe to 2 different providers so that they have a backup network. I'm a one-person consulting firm in my home, and I actually have rely on my wireless as my backup provider if my cable internet goes down, which it does occasionally, but I still need to be on. So that redundancy is important. And then finally, community, making sure that your anchor institutions, your hospitals, your schools, your local governments have the bandwidth that they need, and then also addressing those digital divide issues to make sure that everybody in your community, the low income, the high income areas, all have access to broadband technology. So when you do your needs assessment, you need to ask all these questions. I call them the 5 C's because it's just sort of a good way to remember it. But make sure that you're asking all of these things and looking at all of these factors when you do your needs assessment. A place to start to get data for that needs assessment is going to the FCC website and looking at their 477 data. Again, at the bottom of the slide is a link to this website. The 477 data, the service providers are required to file data with the FCC on an annual basis, and they file it on Form 477, which is why it's called 477 data. The FCC has compiled that and now has that information mapped. This map just became available this year. The first round of 477 data was collected in 2016, so the mapping is based on data that was collected in the last part of 2016, so it is about a year and a half old. But it does give you an idea. You can zoom in on the map to your county. You can zoom into the census block level on this map, and you can see how many providers are in that census block. So right off the bat, you can see if you have, multiple choice in providers. You can click on area summary, and it will give you the percentage of households that have access to the internet at various speeds from 25 megabits all the way up, I think, to 50 megabit service. So you can zoom in on this map to get your information. You can see what different speeds are being offered in the area, whether it's fixed, whether it's wireless, and you can compare how your community is doing to other communities, to other counties and other states. So this is a good place to at least start getting the information. It is a good starting point for discussion. It's worth noting that this information is self-reported by the providers, so it's not independently verified. It's what their advertised speed is. So oftentimes you'll hear that this data is not accurate, but it is information that is given by the providers. So if the providers are saying the information is not accurate, then the question is, well, why aren't you providing us accurate information? Because this information does come from you. So it is a starting point for discussion. It does give you good comparative data to see how you're doing, and then you can refine that through the planning process. You can refine it through surveys. You can refine it through working with your GIS people to do some speed tests to verify some of the information. But this is at least a good starting point for you to collect the information for your needs assessment. The next step in the process, once you complete your needs assessment, is to actually adopt some vision and goals and to develop a policy framework. Like I said, I have worked with a number of communities. I've done surveys for some of the APA reports that I've written that have included over 200 communities to ask them, if you are adopting, broadband goals or policies, how are you doing this? Some of the communities are actually now including telecommunications or broadband elements in their comprehensive plans, and they're adopting those policies right in their plans. As planner, I recommend that every community is doing that. The survey that I did, I think it was 4 years ago, only 15% of communities actually had broadband policies in their comprehensive plans. I'm hoping that that number has increased, and I would encourage everybody, since we're all planners on this call, to at least include a component for broadband infrastructure in your plan, and to include some of the data from the FCC there so that you can start developing benchmarks and measurements and putting that information in your comprehensive plans. Some communities have taken it a step further. They've actually developed a task force to look at broadband issues. That task force has produced a report, and sometimes from those task force efforts come resolutions with actual policies for making the community broadband ready, for going after grants, for adopting dig once policies, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And then some communities have actually developed a full-blown broadband plan that's saying, we want to invest in broadband networks, and we have a broadband plan. We've done a feasibility study. We've done the financials. And so they have taken it to all that step. But I would say at the very least, every community should at least have some broadband information and policies in their comprehensive plans. And maybe one of the recommendations might be in your comp plan is to form a task force and take it along those next steps. But these are some ways that communities have actually been adopting broadband policies. Some of the broadband goals, again, I did a survey of over 200 communities for a report that I was doing for APA. And of those communities that had adopted some broadband plans or had some information in their technology or in their comprehensive plans, these were some of the common goals. I've sort of compressed these and summarized them. Some of them were a lot more detailed than this. But these were common goals or subject areas that they were addressing in their comprehensive plans or their broadband plans. To have affordable and reliable broadband to every home, business, and anchor institutions, to address those digital divide issues, to use broadband technologies to promote sustainability in their community, to expand the infrastructure, to include neighborhoods that might have been underserved before, to coordinate broadband plans with other planning processes. If you are doing a downtown plan, then that downtown plan should have strategies for including broadband or fiber to the curb so that you can attract businesses downtown. Addressing some of the cybersecurity and privacy issues that are out there to promote telework and telecommuting. And finally, to use public-private partnerships to deploy broadband. And so the rest of the presentation is going to be really focusing on that last one, the public-private partnerships and business models to deploy broadband. And one of the things that is important to remember is that one size does not fit all. There are a lot of different models out there, and I'm going to go over 3 different models that are sort of give you a general idea what they are. They are hybrids of those models, different versions of them. What you need to do is go through the process and find the model that fits your community. So the three models that I'm going to review, and I've grouped them into these categories, are the private provider model, the municipal utility model, and the community open access network model. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to talk about is the private provider model. And this is by far the most common model that communities are pursuing to promote broadband deployment in their community. In this model, the private provider, or providers in most cases, because most often you have multiple providers, well, not most often, but often you have multiple providers, but they own and they operate the network. The end users, the homes and businesses, contract directly with the provider and purchase service from them. And the important thing to remember about the private provider model, whether it's a co-op, whether it's a for-profit company, is that when they make their investment decisions on where they're going to install infrastructure or expand broadband infrastructure, is they are looking at the return on investment. Again, this is private sector. They need to look at that bottom line, and that is the important factor in their decisions to expand broadband infrastructure in their community. So what you want to do as a community, if you are going to be relying on the private providers to deploy broadband infrastructure and provide these services, is you really need to look at how you can work with them on that bottom line, on that return on investment, and that will induce them, to make investments in your community. So there's really two ways that you can affect the bottom line. One of the ways is to reduce cost, and the other way is to enhance revenue, increase their revenue. I mean, those are any business model. You're either going to be looking at cost and revenue, and it's the same thing in working with private providers. So some of the things that you can do to reduce cost is dig once joint trenching policies. Dig once policies is the term that is used to, when you open the street, to put multiple conduits all in at once so that you don't have to reopen the street and keep retrenching. When providers are putting in fiber, the most expensive part of the project, there's really sort of three expense items. One is the fiber, one is the labor to install it and trench, and the other are the electronics. The most cheapest part of that is the fiber. The fiber itself does not cost that much. The most expensive part is the trenching. It's the digging up the streets and putting that in. So if the community is doing a major street project, water sewer project, if they just put in conduit, that's a provider can pull in fiber later on, and they can lease it to that provider, that will be cheaper. Or at the very least, they can inform the providers, we're going to be opening up the street. If you want to put in your own conduit in there or install your fiber at this time, alert them to that opportunity so that they can save the cost. Reducing right-of-way permit fees is another way to reduce costs. Reducing regulatory barriers. If you look at the link on the bottom of this page, it's to an FCC report that talks about reducing regulatory barriers. They actually have a checklist online that's very simple things that communities can be doing to make their community fiber ready or broadband ready and help reduce the cost for the private providers. It's everything from just making sure your public work standards are up to date and reflect and are clear and consistent. So if the providers do have to go in and open up the street, they understand ahead of time what's going to be required of them. Looking at your fees and seeing how you compare to other communities. Publishing this online or having a point of contact that's easy for them to talk to and process these fees. Actually, it's not, a lot of the strategies are not that much different than what you would do for other permitting processes that you're already dealing with. And so you can download that checklist online, share it with your public works department. It's another way to sort of streamline processes and reduce costs. Leasing towers and conduits to them that maybe the community has installed. As I mentioned, there was one community where the parking commission had installed conduits all throughout downtown to connect the parking meters so that they could have smart meters. It turned out that they could lease some of that space to the providers, and the providers didn't have to get the permits and go through the process of installing their own conduits. Identifying sites where they can co-locate towers, sharing the cost for engineering studies, all at low interest loans to providers. All of these things are things that you can do to reduce costs. Enhancing revenue, aggregate demand, I'm going to talk about that in another slide, but providing some actual financial incentives, helping them to increase their customer base by addressing adoption and digital literacy issues, so that increases their revenue, helping them with marketing their services, again, so that more people are aware of what's available and will take advantage of those services, and signing on to long-term contracts so that they have guaranteed revenue source for years to come. So these are just strategies. If the community does not have the ability or political will to go out and build their own networks, and their main strategy is going to be, how can we work with private providers? These are some of the things that you can do. The case study that I thought would be useful to sort of demonstrate this, and this is a county in Minnesota, very rural county, only 7,000 population. Their service, all they had access was to 3 megabit DSL service. Their incumbent was not interested in investing to upgrade that services. So what they did was they got a grant, and they did some initial planning for the area, and then put out an RFI, a request for information, to see if there were any other providers that might be interested in partnering with them to upgrade their services. They did get a provider who was in another, I don't know if it was an adjoining county, but somewhere in the region, that responded to the RFP. So they looked at doing a feasibility study and actually doing the preliminary engineering to see what it would take to upgrade the services. And the county shared in the cost of that. And then the county also helped them apply for grants to build the network and gave them a low interest loan so to help them build the network. So they were able to upgrade this, not by the county itself didn't go out and build any infrastructure, but they found a partner and then helped share some of the costs so that they could help that bottom line and get them to invest in their community. Another model that has been used quite a bit is called the aggregate demand model. And again, this is working with your providers. So you get a number of the large broadband users or anchor institutions, which are your schools, your hospitals, your libraries, local governments, to all come together and leverage their collective purchasing power to attract a provider. So rather than each of these entities individually negotiating services with multiple providers, they come together and they issue one RFP. They bundled it all together. And now they have a big contract out there that's going to attract interest from different providers. And it's basically, we'll put out an RFP. We're willing to sign a 5-year contract with all of these major institutions here for and in the RFP you set the minimum level of service. So if you're only getting 3 megabit per service in this one county, you might say, we will bundle this contract together. We'll assign contracts if we get 25 meg service or whatever it is that you want out there. Another term for this is called commodity internet purchasing. So if you Google that, you'll get some aggregate demand or commodity internet purchasing are two terms that you can use. And at the end of the presentation, I have some websites that you can go to that actually have sample RFPs that communities have used to purchase these services. and you could use those as templates if you're interested in that. But again, this is working with the private providers. The localities are not going out and building any networks. They're just taking the monetary resources that they're already spending on telecommunication services, bundling into a contract and using that as an incentive to get the providers to upgrade their networks. So this is just a flow chart to show you how a process using this aggregate demand model might work. As you identify the stakeholders, your major institutions, everybody assesses their total broadband needs or bandwidth needs, and they can usually do that by just looking at the telephone bills or your internet bills that you already have and saying, okay, we're already spending X amount of dollars on this anyway. If we spend this, let's just bundle this all and say we have a contract that we're willing to spend this much. You define the contract terms. You say this is the service that we want. We're willing to take all this money that we've been spending, bundle it into one big contract. If you upgrade our network, there might be other incentives that you want to offer in there, like the County of Minnesota said we'll help pay for the feasibility study. Whatever other incentives we have, tower sites that we will lease to you. We have conduit that we will lease to you. Whatever other incentives your communities can have, you put into that RFP, you issue it, and then the partners that are bundling their services will have to enter into a memorandum of understanding, but then you select your vendor and negotiate the contract. So those are sort of the steps for that aggregate demand model. The next model we're going to look at is the municipal utility model. So in this model, there's typically an existing utility, an electric utility or a power company that is already have its own network of telephone poles or whatever, and they are going to go out and add telecom or broadband services to the services that they already offer, to the electric services. So they own and operate the network. The end users, your homes and businesses, purchase from the municipal utility, just like their power customers. Now they're going to be broadband customers. And the return on investment, because it's a public entity with a private sector provider, they have a shorter term on return of investment. They need to take that money and reinvest it in their network if they're going to remain competitive. If you're a municipal utility, you don't have that same time frame. You have a longer time frame to pay it off, which makes it a little bit more, your business model a little bit differently. And oftentimes, this will represent a cost savings to the municipality, because the municipality, instead of paying a provider, a private sector person to provide your telecommunication services, now they own and operate the network themselves, and they use the money that they were paying for outside services to build the network. And in the long run, there can actually be cost savings to the communities, because they don't have to make that monthly payment every month. Once the network pays itself off, they don't have to make the payment anymore. So those are the basics of that model. Some other things with the municipal utility model is it might have multiple funding sources. The user fees, what you charge your customers to use the broadband services. You can finance it with revenue bonds, or you have the option, if you're a municipality, to finance it with general obligation bonds. Tax increment finance districts, special improvement districts are options that are available to municipal utilities that aren't available to the private sector. Applying for grants. And again, that existing telecommunications budget that you already have, if you're paying $50,000 a month to a private sector company, that's $50,000 a month that you can pay to pay off a bond and build the network. These networks have, because they're municipal owned, they need to have public benefits. So public safety, economic development, addressing digital divide issues, smart city technologies. A lot of the networks have been part of a smart grid network or a smart transportation network. So they typically are almost always have other public benefit in addition to providing broadband. Probably one of the more well-known municipal utility networks was in Chattanooga. Chattanooga built a fiber to the home 1 gig network. A few years back, they advertised that they were the first gigabit city. And some people said there were other gigabit cities before them, but that's how they advertised themselves. They've been very successful in marketing it. They had a municipal utility. They were actually putting the fiber in as part of a smart grid system, and decided that they would offer it as fiber to the home. So if you go to the Chattanooga, just Chattanooga Gigabit City, you will be able to find out more information on that project. The downside about the municipal utility network is that, one, municipal utilities do not comprise a large portion of the population. I live in Montana. There's only one municipal utility in the state, so that's really not an option here. So if you look at this map, this is from muninetworks.org. They have a lot of information on these municipal networks, and you'll see there's quite a few red states in there. The red states in this map means that those states have passed prohibitions on municipalities building broadband networks. So if you live in some of the states, communities built the networks before those prohibitions were passed, but and they've been grandfathered in some cases. But if you live in those states where they have red states, there's actually some prohibitions on the municipalities being able to go out and build these networks. So the municipal utility network is a model that has had some success, but its application is somewhat limited where communities can do that. Because if you live in a community that doesn't have a municipal utility, or if you live in one of these states that has prohibitions on them, I mean, this is a model that's not going to be available to you. But if you are interested in that model, the muninetworks.org is a very good website to go to. The other last model that I'm going to talk about is called the open access network model. This is where a public entity, they own and operate the network, but they don't sell it directly to the end users. They build it and they sell the services to the providers, wholesale services. And so then the providers lease the fiber from them, and then they actually provide services to the network. What this does is that helps that bottom line for the provider. They can now come into a community where maybe for whatever reason it wasn't economical for them to build services in the community. So the community builds the services and leases it to them. So they have an incentive now for the provider to come in, lease the services from them, but the providers are the ones that are providing the services. So the communities will lease it to anybody. That's why it's open access. Some people call it the airport model, where the community builds the airport, but then they lease the terminals to a number of different airlines. So this is the same thing. The community owns the network, but they lease it to the providers, who then come in and sell it. So it usually has, again, that longer return on investment because it's community owned or nonprofit owned, so they don't have the same business model as a private predictor. You can have a lot of multiple funding sources, just sort of the same funding sources we talked about, with the municipal network. And typically they have that public benefit too. So a project that I worked on recently with the open access model was Bozeman, Montana. The feasibility study for the model was funded by the city and the local economic development agency, and they received some grants. And importantly, they received some hefty community contributions from the school district and the hospital to help fund the study because they were very interested in this network. Montana actually has some legislation that does restrict municipalities from providing internet services. So they formed a nonprofit. The municipality, City of Bozeman, sits on the nonprofit board, but it's actually the nonprofit that built the network, owns the network, and provides oversight for the network. They contract with a private contractor to operate the network. So even though this nonprofit built the network, they have a private contractor who has expertise in this area to operate the network for them. The financing for it came primarily from local banks. So they did not get a grant to build a network, but they got those long-term contracts with the school and the hospital. So that was a guaranteed revenue source, and so the bank was willing, based on that revenue source, to finance the network for them. Phase 1 has been completed, and since it's been completed, they now have 5 providers that are offering services over the network. So the sort of timeline for this is to identify your stakeholders, again, assess your bandwidth needs, evaluate your different alternatives, your different network alternatives, financing alternatives, for building a network, doing the feasibility study. You're going to need a network design. You're going to need an operational plan. Like I said, in Bozeman, they contracted with a private consultant to operate the network for them. But if you're going to do it in-house, you're going to need an operational plan, and then you're going to need to build the network. So that's just a very brief summary of how you would go about it in the open access network. Some funding that is available, if you look at the link at the bottom of this page, it's a document that has a lot of the federal funding that's available there. But again, an important one for this is looking at what you're already spending for telecommunication services, and you take that budget and you use it to pay off the loans or the bonds. Again, if you're a public entity, you might have access to revenue bonds, TIP districts, look at your capital improvement plan, and see if you can install infrastructure as part of street work anyway. And then those public-private partnerships with the hospitals, with the banks, with the local institutions. So some of the lessons learned from looking at these case studies, and I have done a lot of research and looked at case studies, is you have to have solid financials if you're going to move forward. With any of the plans where the city is actually investing in the network, you need to look at that return on investment. That's very important. Developing it in phases so that the initial phase you can sort of work out the kinks, learn what works, deploy to areas of high demand so that you can generate some revenue to support the network. Make sure you have that community support, because this is going to take years to implement, and if you have a turnover in elected officials and you lose the support midway through the project, that can be a real problem. So you want to make sure that you have solid leadership, a community champion, and partnerships that are going to keep this thing moving forward. And you're going to want to do a risk assessment to make sure that you can anticipate some of the things that might go wrong, and that you have strategies to deal with that. This is, if you're providing broadband services and you're building out a network, the incumbent provider is a competitor. They might lower the rates, which can change your business model. The build out might take a lot longer than anticipated. You can have changes in legislation that will affect your business model too. So you want to look at that ahead of time. These are some resources, in addition to the ones that I put on the bottom of the slide. If you're interested in this, the first one, Broadband, the NTIA is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. They have monthly webinars with case studies of communities that have done this. They have a lot of resources on there. Broadband Magazine, they hold 2 trade conferences every year, one in the spring, one in the fall. A lot of good resources. Vendors go to that you might be dealing with. Fiberbroadband.org and GigU and Blandon Foundation all have sample RFPs and templates on there, and toolboxes for communities involved in this. Eric Frederick, who gave the webinar in April, is with Connected Nation. They have a lot of information in there on broadband adoption. And finally, the last, resourceballer.com is a law firm. They have a lot of information on states that have passed restrictions. So if you're interested, is my state one of those that has restrictions on municipalities? You can go there and find out some of that. And then there is the PAS report, Planning and Broadband, that's available from APA. So that's the end of my presentation, and we are ready for questions.
Okay, thank you. Everyone, just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, just type it in the questions box in the GoToWebinar tool panel. Don't raise your hand because we don't have a way of letting you speak right now. So our first question, can you say something about broadband, 5G, and CAVs, connected and autonomous vehicles? aren't we going to need a lot of broadband for that?
Yeah, and so 5G is stands for fifth generation. It's the new wireless technology that's coming out. It does have the ability to provide higher speeds, but it also is going to require more towers, because instead of having one big tower that broadcasts out for long distances, it's generally a lot more towers. So you probably will be, as a planning office, if you're permitting towers or you have zoning regulations that deal with that, you are going to see just a continued increased request for those towers. And yes, autonomous vehicles are based on sensors that are throughout the community. Some of them are embedded into the streets. Some of them are antennas that are on street poles. It's vehicle to vehicle communication. It's vehicle to road communication. So it is going to require that broadband infrastructure there. All of the smart city applications are going to ride on broadband infrastructure. So you're going to need the mobile wireless technology for the smart infrastructure. You're going to need the fiber technology, and that's why it's becoming more important. APA has been just released an autonomous vehicle white paper or playbook, I think is what they call it. So if you go to the APA planning website, they have just recently released in the last few months a paper that talks specifically about autonomous vehicles. And also I have received a grant from APA to do research on smart cities and comprehensive plan policies, and what you need to be doing in your comprehensive plans to start accommodating those smart city technologies, not only autonomous vehicles, but smart water and smart grid applications. So that's going to be available as part of the APA's update of their comprehensive plan standards. Is the next update will reflect smart city technologies. So you're absolutely right. It's going to require more broadband, more towers, more fiber infrastructure, and APA is addressing those issues and does have some material on their website for that.
Great, thank you. Are you familiar with the Utopia network in Utah? Is it an open access model that includes a consortium of a number of cities?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yes, I am familiar with Utopia. I actually did a case study on that right after it was constructed back in, I think, 2005. It was a consortium of communities in Utah that built a fiber network. Initially, I think they were going to, it was going to be more like the municipal utility model, where they would be selling the network directly to the end user customer. As they were building out the network, the legislation changed in Utah and prohibited, if you recall the map that I had up there, Utah was one of the red states. It wasn't a red, well, it was always a red state in some degrees, but it wasn't a state that had the prohibitions when they started building the network. So their business model changed midway, and that's one of those, when you do the risk assessment, you need to, one of the things you need to look at. That's happened in a number of states. I think Wilson, North Carolina is another state where they built a network, and then after they built it, the state passed legislation to prohibit communities from offering internet services. Some of the networks are grandfathered in. It really varies from state to state. In Utah, the Utopia network, went through a lot of setbacks because of this change in legislation. At one point, they considered selling the network. They did not, and I recently read an article just last month that they are selling services wholesale over the network. So they're not offering at retail, which was their original business model. But they do have, it's more like an open access network now, and that they have actually generated enough revenue now to, I think, for the first time, generate a profit. So There is, if you go to muninetworks.org, that website that I had up there, and just search on Utopia, they will have articles about that, or the network itself has a newsletter. But that's one of the reasons why, if you are considering investing in a network in your community, you really need to do a risk assessment and need to look at what the legislation is, or what might be coming down the pike. And like I said, that one resource that I had on the slide with the law firm, Baller.com, they have put an annual report up on the state of state legislation, so that you can sort of look at that as a starting point to see what will be happening in your state.
Okay, thanks. Okay, this is an interesting question. The citizens of, I think you pronounce it Kalispell, they recently convinced their board to reject an offer to have a cell tower located on the roof of a high school because of the potentially negative effects of radio waves to the students. Have you heard of any negative health effects from towers?
No, I actually live 11 miles from Kalispell, so I'm very familiar with that issue. And one of the strategies that I've always promoted is look at your public buildings as potential co-location sites for wireless facilities. There have not been, I'm not aware of studies that have shown that there are health concerns directly related to the electromagnetic waves from cellular towers. There are studies that might show some correlation between if you live near a tower, there might be some increased health risk, but the correlation is one of those, you're living in a denser area. Is it tied to cell phone usage, or is it tied to something else? And you are exposed to those. Cell phones there's such a proliferation of them throughout the community anymore. Whether it's on the building that you're at, it's probably going to be on the building next door. You're going to be exposed to those anyway. And so I think they did turn that down. It was going to generate $2,000 a month revenue for the school. It might be something that they revisit, but there was enough community concern that the school board didn't want to take any risk. But in the studies that I've read, I've never seen anything that at least has caused me alarm and that would discourage me from telling a community to look at that as a potential location site.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Excuse me. Are there opportunities for a homeowners association to work with broadband providers, and are there opportunities for them to apply for grants? And this question is particularly for rural areas, but I suppose if you can answer it for any HOA, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, there are some developers, and I can particularly think of Florida, that now put in fiber to the curb as part of the development. When they put the initial infrastructure in, they do that, and then they market their subdivision or their development as being fiber ready. So for new developments, I think I've talked to a number of developers, and this is now, it's not that expensive to put it in as you're building the streets. It's a lot more expensive to put it in after the fact. So homeowners associations, I think that they would need to work, find a provider that was willing to come in. As far as them receiving grants directly to the homeowners association, that's probably not likely because the grants go to a public entity. But if there is a community plan, and this is part of a bigger plan where the community is, perhaps, working on broadband, and maybe they can include the subdivision because the subdivision has come up with some money to contribute to offsetting that bottom line for the investment, that's a possibility. You would need to go through the planning process, I think with the county that you're in, especially with the rural county that you're in. If you were going to apply for any grant, it would need to come from a public agency. It's the experience of homeowners working directly with the providers is really mixed, because again, you're looking at the providers are looking at their bottom line, and it depends how big homeowners association is and how much money they're going to bring to the table. Because frankly, that's their driving factor. You might be able to, and I've seen this in communities where they might be able to demonstrate that they can generate a profit, they can pay for the investment, but the provider is like, well, yeah, but I have another property or community over here that I can make even more money at. So it's not just enough to say you can break even or you can make some money, but is this going to be the highest return on investment compared to the other opportunities that they have? Probably the homeowner association would be, if they wanted to do something like that, would be similar to the strategies that we talked about, putting out an RFP and soliciting bids from different providers. And oftentimes when an incumbent sees that they are soliciting their competitors to come in and issue bids, they'll start to work with them because they don't want that competitor coming in. So probably the same strategies that you would use in the private provider model would be the same ones that you would use if you were a homeowner association.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Any lessons that we can learn from overseas?
Well, one of the interesting things, is the cost model. Is that, like I said, the United States lags behind in affordability. It's just much more expensive to purchase broadband, on a per megabit basis in the United States than it is in other places. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of it is geography. If you look at the countries that have lower broadband costs, a lot of them are smaller countries, and they just don't have the geography and the space that they have to serve, so that allows them to deploy the infrastructure a lot more cost efficiently. But some of that is because the infrastructure is subsidized, by the government, so that brings down broadband costs as well. So it's sort of a combination of those different things. When you look at cost, some of the models in some of the Asian countries, they really built out their mobile networks a lot more and rely on smartphones and mobile networks more than we do. You really need both. And again, being a planner, I would say that every area in the United States is unique, and you just need to go through the planning process that we talked about and identify what your issues are and find the model that works best for you.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's it for our questions. A couple people chimed in, though, that they wanted to know about this webcast recording, and it'll go up on our YouTube channel. We just have to finish it first before I can get it up on YouTube. So it'll go up as soon as we're done here, and a PDF of the presentation will be available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So I think that's it. Kate, thanks for joining us. This was great. And thanks to the Technology Division again for sponsoring this series. And we'll look forward to part 3 of 3 in June. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Okay, thank you. And my information, feel free to email me if you want any of these resource materials.
Great. Thanks everyone.